Stop making these skeuomorphic mistakes. Here's how to get it right. In this video, I'm going to cover the do's and don'ts of skeuomorphism. Using the examples of iOS calculators, especially Steve Jobs' calculator design from the 1984 Macintosh, we'll explore how skeuomorphism has evolved over the decades, especially in the iOS and the Windows systems. Then, we'll use Figma to draw our own calculator and see how we can use tools like shadows, gradients, and textures to make a design pop. With the introduction of GUIs, or graphical user interfaces, in the 1980s, real-world objects started to be represented in digital systems in abstract ways, and they were rendered with textures, highlights, and made to look 3D. And this had a real high point around 2007 with iOS 1.0. By 2013, however, skeuomorphism started to get much more muted and a much more subtle practice. It's important to understand this journey so that you know what contemporary users expect of design. 1984, the Macintosh, it's a black and white interface, but the thing to really watch for over here is the calculator. And there's a whole story about how finicky Steve Jobs was in the design of this particular app. It's interesting if you contrast this with the Windows version from 1992, Windows 3.1, you see that the windows themselves have a lot more texture and three-dimensionality, but the calculator, interestingly, is completely flat compared to the 1984 version of the Mac. So Windows 95 is a real high point for color and skeuomorphism, because you look at the bin, it's three-dimensional, there's a briefcase, it's three-dimensional, the computers themselves look like computers as icons, so very 3D emphasis. And Mac takes that forward in 2001 with an element of glassmorphism. You see an element of that in Windows Vista. And then by 2012, it's completely dead, that movement, and it's gone completely flat. And this is somewhere where we are at right now, somewhere between those two things. And this is illustrated if you look at how the calculators have evolved over the years. So you look at 1984, it's three-dimensional, a lot of textures. The high point in 2007, it looks completely like a real calculator. 2019, absolutely flat. And 2024, a little bit of circles introduced, which I believe is a reference to a classic Braun brand calculator. So we see how UI elements and the practice of skeuomorphism have evolved over the decades. Now, let's talk about a few pitfalls to avoid. So the major pitfall to watch out for is the fact that design has really moved on, and because apps like Figma make adding textures to design and making them three-dimensional, and everything is so straightforward and so easy to draw, you can feel like going wild in adding textures and highlights. But the thing is that we're no longer in 1984 or even the mid-2000s. Today, users no longer need real-world metaphors. Additionally, adding too much texture and highlight causes a lot of visual confusion and can make design look cluttered and overwhelming. This, in conjunction, leads to performance issues. Highly detailed skeuomorphic design elements are slow to load, but even more importantly, the major challenge of design right now is responsiveness. And icons have to look good across various platforms, so responsiveness is very important in design. If you add a lot of textures, how the design will expand or contract depending on a screen size is going to be highly variable. So that's one of the reasons to avoid adding a lot of texture to icons. And this leads me to my final point, which is icon designs should fit a system. Today, with tokenization and styles, you can't really paint an icon. You have to understand exactly mathematically what the texture is, because that texture or that use of texture has to be used across a whole wide range of icons that have to look good as a set. Now that we're aware of how skeuomorphism has evolved over the decades and what contemporary expectations of skeuomorphic features should be, Let's try and create a contemporary design in Figma using gradients and shadows to see if we can give a slightly 3D touch to a design. So I have my own interpretation of the Apple calculator here, and right now it looks too flat. So I'm going to try to add some skeuomorph features like shadows and gradations to see if I can make it pop a little. So the way to add a gradation, and I want to add a gradation to my body right now, is to go to fill, and this is the gradient button. I'm going to add one more gradient there, and I want to keep it radial. Okay, that's all right for me for now. And I want to add a shadow. So that's how you do it from effects. Yeah, I want to drop shadow, and that will be slightly bigger. So I've got that. Then I want to add some shadows to my buttons. So I'm just going to add a drop shadow from effects. Right. Okay. Fine. And the final thing I want to do is I want to change my screen color slightly. So I'll go to my fill, which will be custom. I want to make it slightly greenish. Yeah. And give it a inner shadow. So that's there. Let me leave you with some best practices. Go for subtle realism, depth, and tactile interactions. Skeuomorphism is no longer about literal equivalence, and users are much more sophisticated and habituated to abstraction. Find clarity and legibility are much more important than creating a design that looks very good initially, but over time will cause a lot of fatigue for users. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Subscribe to LogRocket for more UX design tips and tutorials.